I am an associate professor of economics at Montana State University. I do a lot of research related to financial education, and I spend a lot of time thinking about methods and causality, which I think is not substantially different in the space, but not necessarily commonplace in this space, in this research. And I think I spend a lot of time also communicating research to policymakers. So I have been a visiting scholar with the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection and the Federal Reserve Board's Division of Community Affairs. So I've spent a lot of time trying to explain what research findings show kind of in lay terms as well. And I'm really looking forward today to kind of bridge the gap between research and practitioners, and really kind of show you guys what type of data we need to be able to do really solid research. I know a lot of you guys are collecting really great data, but it's not always in formats or in ways that we can actually take it and evaluate policies. So I really look forward to kind of bridging that and also having you guys think more carefully, maybe not more carefully, but more readily about how we approach research and how we're always kind of looking for this kind of natural experiment that's just happening out there and that we can collect more data on. So more on that.
Hi, so I'm Chris Stoddard. I'm a professor of economics at Montana State University. Most of my research in the past has been more related to education policy, so teacher labor markets, charter schools, for-profit universities. So I'm a little bit newer in this area of financial education, but also spend a lot of time sort of thinking about what does this look like in terms of recruiting and retaining the best teachers to teach in that area. And I would just echo what Carly had to say about us hoping to both, communicate our findings in a way that's practical. I got ambushed last night with the what's your so what, so hopefully we'll be able to convey our so what at the end of this, but also learn more from you about what are the questions that you'd like to hear researchers looking at going forward. And then, as Carly said, hopefully we can also communicate to you what it takes for us to be able to evaluate them in a rigorous way where we feel comfortable pounding on the table and saying, yes, this really does work, and have a lot of confidence behind that.
Okay, so the work we're going to present today, I'm going to start us off and then Chris is going to jump in halfway through, is on state-mandated high school financial education and college financing behavior. So a lot of you guys know a lot about high school financial education mandates. Some of you guys have taught. Some of you are really intimate with how these policies have changed over time. I'm excited to talk to more of you guys about that today. But today we're really going to focus on student loans. Okay, so, and beyond student loans, the entire decision on how to finance post-secondary education. So right now, or as of the summer, student loan debt was about $1.4 trillion, and people like to freak out about this, right? This is a huge issue. How can we solve this problem? How do we reduce student loan debt? When actually there's a lot of research suggesting that people are actually credit constrained, especially low-income, high-ability students who are probably under-borrowing, right? So we can't really say what students are doing, quote-unquote, optimally as an economist, right? We want to be able to say, are people making informed decisions? And to the extent that they have enough information to make a good decision, are they doing the right things? So we can't just say student loans should go up or down. We can't say if that's good or bad, right? What we can say are, do students have enough information to make good borrowing decisions? We know it's the first large financial decision a lot of people make. So when you're 18, you have to make this really big decision about loans that are potentially going to haunt you for the rest of your life. And you are not very smart necessarily about making that decision, right? You have very limited experience with the credit market and borrowing, all that kind of stuff. Now the PISA, which is 15-year-olds, right? So testing 15-year-olds on financial literacy skills, suggests that only about 29% of these students can compare loans with different interest rates and different terms, right? So if they can't do that, how can they make a good trade-off about a student loan, right? At the same time, we know from a lot of work from Anna Maria Lusardi that there's low financial literacy among the young. Less than a third can actually correctly answer three pretty simple questions about interest rates, diversification, and inflation. And there's also some new evidence from the National Financial Capability Study that the Finner Foundation puts out that a little over half of student loan borrowers never calculated their future monthly payments, which might not be a shocker, but a little over half also said they would make a change if they could go back in time, so there's some regret. And there's even more regret for those who had private student loans as opposed to public student loans. So there's a lot of suggestive evidence out there that maybe students really don't have enough information to make this really complicated decision on how to finance their post-secondary education. Okay? Now, when you get a grant from NEFE and you are someone who is obsessed with causality and you love to do things that are kind of above the anecdote, Billy loves to make you do qualitative work. So we actually did 3 focus groups, which we learned quite a bit from. And I think this quote was one of the ones that resonated the most. One student said, I think it would have been nice if in high school they offered like a life skills class, like how to pay taxes and how to do finances. And I know that there is one, but maybe make this one mandatory, because if I'm young and dumb now and really young and dumb in high school and I don't know what to take that boring class, but it would have been nice to know that stuff now. Like there's a lot of things in high school that I hated, but now I appreciate because college is hard. And I think that's one of them. So that was one of the quotes that really resonated with us. And we were like, oh, okay. You were in the room for that, just, yeah, per chance. So the policy response that we're thinking about to kind of rectify this quote unquote information problem is personal finance coursework in high school. And what we're looking at that as is a graduation requirement. You have to take personal finance before you graduate from high school or you do not get your diploma. Okay, so these tallies for states are as of the end of our sample, which I think is 2016. So don't freak out if you think that those counts are wrong. Looking at you, John. And our big research question is, can financial education requirements in high school change students' initial financial aid packages? So we're not just going to look at student loans, we're going to look at the whole package. And we'll give you some more information on what we expect to maybe change. Okay, so I'll get more into that in a minute. Note that the question is not, not sure what happened there. The question is not, do they make student loans go up or down? Okay. All right, so in our paper, we're trying to see how these financial aid behaviors change in states with requirements before and after the passage, compared with students in states without, before and after in those states. So we're comparing 2 differences, we're comparing 2 changes to get at this causal effect, because something else might be happening at that same time, so you can't just compare before and after. And the fact that some states have it and some states don't means that those states are just different. They're going to be different in a lot of other ways, like their quality of education in general, their types of education policies in general, right? So we can't just make direct comparisons across states. We have to compare students within states who graduated the years before and after it was required, compared to students in other states without requirements before and after, comparing 2 changes. Then we're going to say, for whom does financial education change behavior? You see a lot of stuff out there saying financial education works, financial education doesn't work. Financial education is not a microwave. It doesn't work or not work. It's going to work for some people or not, or others. It's going to be more effective for some groups than others. So for whom is it actually changing behavior? Then we're going to examine one state where we can go local. So we're going to get lots of detailed information from Montana to see which school districts offered financial education and when over a long time horizon, and the when is going to be important there. And there's no graduation requirement in Montana, and we're going to see how offering an elective changes student loan packages. And then we're also going to show that personal finance education, so these requirements don't actually change college attendance decisions. And we'll talk about that more later. So you guys have probably seen a lot of the previous research on state-mandated financial education in high school and other outcomes. This is actually quite a large literature that many people have contributed to. One thing that I'm going to say right off the bat is if you only look at states that are in the US and have quasi-experimental methods that allow you to pin down causality, it actually limits the number of studies quite a bit to about 4. Right? So that's the first cut. If you look at all these studies, you're going to see positive effects, negative effects, 0 effects. Everything's going to be all over the place. But once you narrow it down, there's really an easy way to categorize it. One is that if you look at some of these long-run papers, they all look at these older mandates that are way before the year 2000, when there really wasn't anything required when you look at the specifics, right? These are more home economics, and there are a lot more talk about interest rates once in class or bring somebody in from a bank, and that checks the box. That doesn't really sound like the financial education requirements we have today, right? A semester-long class, even 10 hours of instruction is more than that, okay? The newer mandates, the evidence has been a lot more clear. So there are two papers. One is more aggregate, and then my other work that was funded by the Finner Foundation shows that these rigorous mandates actually lower default rates, improve credit scores, and decrease non-student debt. They do modestly increase student loan debt in the Meta Brown paper. So there is some evidence out there that there is this trade-off, right? Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this to this group, what happens in high school financial education courses. You guys can probably tell me more. But I will talk a little bit about one specific thing that we're looking at here. So in Texas, for example, there are post-secondary financing topics in the standards. So they require that all students understand the various methods available to pay for college and other post-secondary education and training. So they need to understand how to complete the FAFSA, how to research and evaluate scholarship opportunities, compare grant options, compare private and federal student loans, evaluate work-study options, and investigate any non-traditional methods of financing college or training. To me, this is call up your rich uncle and maybe become friends again after not really talking for a while. What other ways can you maybe figure out to pay for college, right? When we were in our focus group, some students were talking about how they had cattle that they sold that they were taking care of. So Montana's a little bit different, but non-traditional, right? Okay, so let's talk about the mechanisms for a minute before we actually look at any results. So as I've said several times now, we're not sure if loan amounts should go up or down. We don't know if students are doing things optimally already. We don't know if students are under borrowing or over borrowing. But what we can do is we can define areas where financial education could potentially change behavior for the better. So the first thing is applications for aid, right? More people should probably be applying for aid than actually are. There are a lot of people who are eligible for Pell Grants and do not get them because they did not apply, right? Or they didn't apply on time, okay? The second is obtaining grants or scholarships. Now, this might seem obvious. Yes, everyone should get more grants and scholarships, but it's actually a lot of upfront costs to apply for these, search for them. So maybe there is some trade-off, but if students are getting more grants and scholarships, we can generally think about that as a good thing, right? Credit card balances are something else that I think is understudied in this space. So if students are not borrowing enough, they're going to end up putting more on a credit card, right? So are they racking up credit card debt? Credit cards for these students are going to, this age group at least, are going to have higher interest rates than public student loans for sure, and some private student loans as well. So that trade-off is really important to consider. And then again, private and public loans, this trade-off is actually really important too. So a lot of people might not realize they're actually eligible for unsubsidized Staffords, and they might choose private loans instead, which could be higher interest rates and fewer rates of income-based repayment or other types of repayment plans later. And then finally, if you want to get really into the nitty-gritty, you could think more about subsidized and unsubsidized loans with lower interest rates. So they should be using Stafford subsidized loans more than unsubsidized because the interest rates are, the subsidized loans do not accrue interest during college, okay? I'll leave you with one more quote before I pass it off to Chris. I don't really have any idea how much I'm going to end up paying when I graduate. I know that like on your entrance counseling, when you accept the loan, they tell you about it, but to be quite honest, I didn't really read through it, even though I should have. I knew I'd take those loans out, so I didn't really care how much I was going to pay afterwards. So that's a common theme we actually saw with a lot of the four-year students we talked to. They knew that they were going to rack up debt. They didn't really care how much it was, and they were going to think about it later.
So I'm going to get a little bit into the data and then what we actually found. So this study is drawing from the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, which is a federal study that takes a representative sample of students enrolled in higher education and then gets not only their survey responses and answers to some questions like whether or not you have a credit card that you maintain a balance on, but also gets financial aid data from their institution. So institutions report Stafford loans, Pell grants. So any financial aid that flows through the institution, we are really confident about that data. And then, like I said, we have this student survey data where they tell us about demographics. It's fairly detailed. We know whether or not they have a high school degree and the state where they got their high school degree, some about family background. Again, the credit card balances and the private loans come from those student responses because that doesn't flow through the institution. And then they tell us about whether or not they're working while they're in school. So we used 4 waves of data. There are some older waves. We chose not to use those older waves, kind of going back to the 80s, because of what Carly said, that the older mandates look really different. So we started in 1999, go through 2011. You can see that this is a period where student loan borrowing has increased a lot, right? We have the Great Recession that comes during that period. And so that just emphasizes again why it's so helpful to have states, information from states that don't have financial education requirements and some states that do, so we can kind of control for these trends that are going on everywhere. We focused because institutions are so different, and for-profits in particular are really kind of different animals, even though the borrowing issues at those institutions are I think well documented. We're going to focus mostly on 4-year public and private institutions because we wanted to focus on students who were as close to high school as possible. So we're just going to look at first-year freshmen coming right in. So we figure they're the ones that are going to remember best what they saw in high school. We know that because it's close in time, we know a lot more about what the mandates looked like at that time. We do think it's really interesting and hope to look in future work more at what happens at 2-year institutions, what happens to less traditional students, but it's going to take a little more time before we get to see those play out if those students are going back to school a lot older. So as I mentioned, we know where they lived. We know the college that they're attending. Those aren't necessarily the same place. We're just focusing on these 17, 18, and 19-year-olds. So just to give you a sense here, we have almost 18,000 students who are either from a state that never had a graduation requirement, or they're a student in a state that eventually has a graduation requirement, but they graduate before it. And then there are about 7,500 students who graduated from states and years after the requirement was in place. And so we're basically going to be comparing those two groups, like Carly said, kind of doing a before and after. So this is the classic kind of experimental design, right? If you think about, I'm trying to figure out what's the effect of some new medication. I have a treatment group, I have a control group. I'm going to measure their blood pressure before I give them this pill. I'm going to measure it afterwards. And so that's the kind of data that that we think is the most effective for figuring out whether something works. It's hard, though, as you probably are all aware. It's hard enough tracking down what are policies today. It's really hard to track down what were they, 20 years ago. And so, so one thing we wanted to sort of make a pitch for is that those of you that are tracking data, it's important for funders to understand we need this over a long period, right? And not just kind of a, let's do it today and then, well, okay, now we're done. So. Comparing students across these different treatment and control states and over time. So here's just a map. This was as of 2012 because our last wave comes in then. And you can see in yellow are the states that do not have a mandate as of that date. In green are the states that do have a mandate. One thing that's nice from a research design perspective is that these states are all over the place, right? So we would be really worried if all the states that had a mandate were, say, all clustered in the West, because then we'd think, well, maybe it's something about the economies of the West, right? Maybe it doesn't have to do with these mandates, it's just something about that. But no, we actually see a fair amount of diversity in terms of where states have mandates. Now, these are not all the same, and I think we've got folks in the room that can speak to some of them are stronger than others, but this is kind of a first cut. Do they have a graduation requirement or not? Okay, so here are the initial pass of results. So we look at a bunch of different outcomes, and those outcomes are listed going across the top here. So first we look at whether or not a student even applied for aid. Then do they have a Stafford loan? Do they have a subsidized Stafford loan? Do they have a grant? Do they have a private loan? And then do they have a credit card balance that rolls over? So this is, I don't pay off my credit card each month. And then were they working while enrolled? And so this top row is telling us this percentage effect. What's the effect of being in a state that has a personal financial education graduation mandate? Well, you're about 3% more likely to apply for aid if you're from one of those states. You're about 5% more likely to have a Stafford. And it turns out those are big numbers if we compare them to the mean. So most students are applying for aid. On average, 92%. Kind of across our whole sample are applying for aid. So saying 3% more are applying for aid when they have this personal financial education, that's a big effect because there's not a whole lot of room left. Similarly saying, yeah, students are 5% more likely to have a Stafford. Well, on average, about 56%, 55% of students have a Stafford. 5% more are going to have a Stafford, so kind of a 10 percentage point. Did I say? Okay, 5% points more, so moving up to like 60%, if that's clear, are going to have a Stafford. So again, a pretty large effect. And so we could go across the rest of these. So we're not seeing yet in this initial pass, looking at everybody, at much of an effect on whether or not students have a private loan and on whether or not they're working while enrolled, but do seem to have more of these subsidized loans or federal loans, have a grant, a little bit less likely to work. So I should say these numbers here kind of line up with what we'd seen in the previous literature, that, yeah, it does look like student loans go up, but when we drill down, the story becomes a lot more nuanced. So this is now saying, well, for whom are these effects biggest, right? So what we did is we divided basically the sample in half. So we divided students who have an expected family contribution, so I assume that's a term that's familiar to most folks in this room, but basically that's calculated by the federal government. How much can the family be expected to contribute towards their child's education? So those with an expected family contribution of less than $5,000 a year, and those with expected family contributions of more than $5,000. So lower income and higher income families here. And what do the effects look like there? So first, we see that the number here, so this 3.9 percentage point increase is a bigger number for the higher income kids than for the lower income kids, but it's more statistically significant for the lower income kids. So we can say with more degrees of certainty, yeah, this looks like it really has an effect for low income kids, and that was particularly surprising to us because they're really likely to apply for aid. So if you're from a low-income family, you're much more likely to apply for aid than if you're from a higher income family, and yet we still see an effect kind of across the income distribution on that. We also see, and this is really important here, that for these low-income kids, they're especially likely to have a Stafford loan. And the kind of loan they're especially likely to have is the subsidized one. So that means they're accessing these lower cost forms of borrowing at a much higher rate. So 8.7 percentage points more likely to have a Stafford loan. So if the average was 63%, we've now bumped that up, well past the 70s that now have a subsidized Stafford loan. And you don't see that as much here for these higher income kids, which is not surprising because probably fewer of them are eligible. So if we saw really big effects down here, we'd probably be a little startled and not sure of our results, but this lines up with what we're expecting to see. And I should mention, you saw here almost 96% of people were already applying for these loans. So how can we get much more action on the Stafford loans? We think part of it is, so two things. So certainly students can decline their offer. But the other thing is that many students, even if they fill out the application, they don't fill it out at the right time. They don't have all of their documentation in. They end up having to have a review and maybe don't make it all the way through that process. And so these are students that may even have applied before, but are now being much more effective in actually filling out their application in a timely manner with accurate data. So we can also see those students are 3 percentage points more likely to have a grant, no action on private loans here, but they're less likely to have a credit card balance. And so this is that kind of trade-off that we think we're seeing. We can't say that these are exactly the same students, but that students are accessing lower cost forms of borrowing instead of relying on these much higher cost forms of borrowing. We also see that those students are somewhat less likely to work while they're enrolled. And I had a conversation with, sorry, I've forgotten your name, Brian, last night, where we were talking about kind of student bandwidth and the different budget constraints essentially that students face. And one of them is time, right? And so to some degree, being able to access lower cost forms of borrowing and not work while you're in school provides people with more opportunities to focus on academics. And there is research showing that, particularly for low-income students, that having that ability to not necessarily have to work quite as much during school improves their academic outcomes. So this next slide says, okay, that was looking at everybody, averaging across everybody. Let's just drill down into the ones who are actually applying. If you're an applier, you applied for aid, what are the effects there? And it's a similar story. So if you applied for aid, you're 5 percentage points more likely to have a Stafford. So that means all of our effect isn't just coming from applying, but applying more correctly or in a more timely fashion. Again, we see that that effect is much bigger for lower income students, though we still see some of an effect on these subsidized Stafford loans for higher income students. These are looking at the loan balances, and the thing that really jumped out to us here is that loan balances, so if you borrowed, you're pretty much borrowing about what everybody else was borrowing. So the main mechanism is getting people to apply and apply in a more timely manner, with one exception, and that exception is students who take out private loans. And so students who take out private loans are borrowing smaller amounts. So if they're from a state in a year where they had this personal finance graduation requirement, they're taking out, and they were the kind of student that would have taken out a private loan before, those private loan borrowers are now borrowing, $1,300 less. So that's a pretty big effect. Again, considering that the average private loan is about $7,000. So this is for a given year. So that startled us that was so big. But not surprisingly, where we see that coming from is mostly from higher income families. And that's not surprising because lower income families are less likely to have access to that private credit market. So private loans, we see more of them in the families that have higher incomes. And so among those high income families, we see really large reductions in the dollars of private loans that students are taking out when they've been exposed to this personal finance course. Or personal finance graduation requirement, I should say. Okay, so being economists, then we did a whole bunch of things to beat on our results and try to see if we could make them go away. And basically the answer is no, they're really robust. So we did a bunch of things to try to see, is it our income measure? What if we use income instead of EFC? What if we put tuition in there? What if we control for SAT scores? We also were worried a little bit about, well, are the states that are passing these requirements, are they different from states that don't pass the requirements? And so we included other kinds of state economic indicators, so state unemployment rates, house prices, and then we said, well, is it states are passing kind of bundles of education bills, bundles of reforms, and maybe it's not personal finance, maybe it's something else. So we controlled for total math credits required for graduation, the highest math level required for graduation, total credits required for graduation. A lot of states now require students to take the ACT as part of their curriculum. We controlled for whether or not the state has adopted the Common Core standards. None of that changed our basic results. So we feel really confident about what we've showed you. This is a slide that's more for economists, where we say then, I told you that like before and after really matters. Economists actually really like you to go back way before and say, well, were those states trending differently before they entered this period? So again, my takeaway from that would be, no, we look great. There are no stars in that top. And also that kind of longitudinal data really helps us to be able to feel confident in our results. So the other thing that we were worried about, and maybe you're thinking about this, is that our sample only includes four-year college students. And so one thing that we were really nervous about was whether students who are exposed to financial education become more nervous. So maybe they sit through those classes and think, gosh, student loans are terrible. Maybe they have an instructor that has that opinion and is passing that on to them. Maybe they're less likely to go to school, or maybe they're going to choose a different institution. And if the place they would have gone is a better match, that could be a real negative. So we were concerned that we might find these kind of unintended negative consequences where students might be picking a different college, a different type of education. And basically, we don't see much change. So when we look at the full set of students in the NPSAS data, we don't see that students are more or less likely to go to private schools. Doesn't look like it changes the tuition of the school they ultimately attend, doesn't really change whether or not they go in state, doesn't really change whether or not they attend a four-year university. So that makes us feel really good that it doesn't seem that the graduation requirements are changing what students are doing. We think in part that may be, or a caveat to that, is that most of these classes are taken when students are juniors or seniors. If you introduce that information like really early on, it could have those effects. But by your junior or senior year, a lot of students kind of have locked in mentally to where they think they're going to apply, where they think they'd like to go. So at least providing the information at that point in time, we don't see those changes. Then we drew on another data set, so from the current population survey, looking at the same age range of students and tried to just look at if college attendance is affected at all, right? Because our data were just college attenders, so now let's look at everybody and see if college attendance rates change in response to these requirements, and they don't. And so again, that's good. That says, or maybe it's neutral, right? Certainly these requirements aren't encouraging more students to go to college, but they also are not discouraging students, making students nervous about taking on student loans. So the last piece of this is a little different. So that concludes that first part. The last piece here is where we drilled down into Montana, because we have connections in the state there, to try to figure out, what if you're in a state that doesn't mandate, doesn't have these graduation requirements? What if you're in a state where it's just, you want to offer it, great. If you don't. So Montana is a very local control state. And so we have data for all students who were Montana high school graduates who come into the Montana University system. So the Montana University system covers both the flagship four-year institutions, our own Montana State and the University of Montana, as well as a lot of the two-year institutions. So any public university in Montana, we're going to pick up their students. And so we were going to look at that data to see if offering a class in high school changes student loan amounts when those students go on in Montana. We cut the slide that tells you, actually, if you thought like Montanans are really different, besides the cows, we look really similar to the rest of the state. So average student loan balances are right on par with the national average. So what we did, what we had RAs do, is to call all of the high schools in Montana and find out if they currently offer a personal finance course, and if they do, when did they start offering it? So we could get that longitudinal aspect. So we could see, okay, here's Bozeman High School, and they started offering it in this year, so we can compare students who graduated from Bozeman High School before that course was in place to students after that course was in place, and same thing across all the high schools in Montana, including ones that don't even offer it. So what we found, is that about 41% of students attended a school that offered a personal finance course. We don't know if the student took it or not, but we know that they had that option, right? And so this is showing in yellow here Areas in the state where the high school there offered a personal finance course and did not offer one, and then in green is areas that did. And again, you can see it's kind of all over the map. So, we've got I-90 here, so it doesn't look like it runs right along the highway. It's not necessarily the more urbanized areas. It kind of was whether there was a teacher or a principal who, this was important to them, so it was really idiosyncratic. So we use the same difference in difference strategy. So we're going to compare students within the same high school, some who graduated before the course was offered, some who graduated after. And then over the same time period, we're going to look at students from high schools who never offered or always offered that course. And what we found was that simply offering the course, not having a graduation requirement, but just simply offering it, did not change anything. We did not find any changes in college financing behavior. So down here you can see, no changes on whether they had a subsidized Stafford or an unsubsidized Stafford or a grant. We actually looked at a whole bunch of outcomes and we just really found nothing. So why is that? So we've come up with a couple of explanations, some of which maybe we can verify with more drilling down. One is that, take-up may be low, right? Okay, the school offers it, but if only 5 students take it, probably we're not going to see much. The other thing that we've found, just kind of anecdotally, and we'd love to hear more from you all to get a sense of whether or not this is true, is that the type of students who voluntarily take the class may be less likely to improve their college financing behavior. In fact, what we've seen at a lot of these schools is that the type of students that voluntarily take that class may not be college tracked at all. So it's kind of like, oh, here's an easy elective for you, we're going to put you in this class, and that student's not even, the class may have improved other outcomes for that student, we don't know that, but what we know is that it didn't improve their student loan outcomes. Well, if they're not in college, we're not going to see any effect. The other thing that is something, again, which you may all have more information about, is that when it's optional, the implementation may actually not be that great. So we don't really know exactly what's going on in those schools where these courses are offered, but lacking kind of state guidelines or state standards, it may be that just the implementation isn't that great. And so that, again, speaks to this issue of kind of what's the quality of the class. Like Carly said, it's not a microwave, so all right. So here's our final concluding quote here. So this student was super chatty. So it was a kick. A lot of times the people that are in these positions, your teachers or whatever, they make the assumption that you have a certain baseline of knowledge about financial aid by virtue of being a student, which really doesn't help the student. He was kind of talking about how, I was planning to go to college, so everybody assumed I knew what I was doing. So you hear all these lofty terms, which I really love his lofty terms, right? Like, hey, you should get a scholarship, right? That's his lofty term. And it's like, yeah, I should, but how? You should get financial aid. Yeah, and that's where the conversation ends. So unless you got your parents or somebody that, really harping home about how important it is, it's going to take you longer. Like, what questions do I even ask? And I think this last point about what questions do I even ask, even if we're not telling students, and hopefully we're not telling students in these classes, oh, you should all be doing X, Y, Z, helping them figure out what questions they should even ask might be an important component of that. So that concludes our presentation. I have a few bullet points just to summarize again what I've already said. So high school financial education, these graduation requirements do change initial age packages. More public loans for all students, fewer private loans, lower balances for high-income borrowers, less credit card balances for low-income students, so, and more grant aid for all students. And then we also see that these lower-income students are reducing work while they're in school. And then that localities that choose to offer courses on their own without adding a requirement, likely it's not enough. We also have thought a little bit about, well, does the benefit outweigh the cost? We're economists, so there's always no free lunch, right? We think the benefits, though, are short run that we've estimated in here. It could actually understate the true benefits. So if we think that these borrowing strategies continue throughout college, and in other work, we've shown that borrowing decisions are highly persistent, or if financial aid affects whether or not a student is retained, the effects could be much bigger than those that we've shown here because we're just looking at that initial freshman financial aid decision. Benefits obviously could extend beyond financial aid decisions that we haven't captured here, reductions in defaults, improvements in credit card scores. What's the cost? I think the cost largely is limited to the opportunity cost of an additional course requirement. If you put in a new course requirement, something else has to come out, right? And so what is that something else? And then obviously the cost of training teachers and supporting school districts.